Dr. Paul had been asked by NPR earlier in the day about his views on federal protections for civil rights. Now, I imagine the reason that NPR brought it up in their interview with him is because it really had been an issue in his campaign. The biggest newspaper in Kentucky, the Louisville Courier-Journal, asked Dr. Paul the same thing last month.
Would you have voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1964?
I like the Civil Rights Act in the sense that it ended discrimination in all public domains, and I'm all in favor of that.
But?
You had to ask me the but. I don't like the idea of telling private business owners. I abhor racism. I think it's a bad business decision to ever exclude anybody from your restaurant. But at the same time, I do believe in private ownership. But I think there should be absolutely no discrimination in anything that gets any public funding. And that's most of what the Civil Rights Act was about, to my mind.
Most of it. Dr. Paul's belief that government shouldn't tell private business it can't put up, say, a "No Black People Allowed" sign. That belief is the reason that newspaper, the Louisville Courier-Journal, did not endorse him in his primary. They didn't endorse either him or his opponent. By the way, I should mention, Dr. Paul said last night on our air that the Courier-Journal never endorses Republican candidates. That is not true. They've endorsed plenty of Republican candidates over the years. You see some of them scrolling here. They just didn't endorse Rand Paul or his opponent Trey Grayson in this particular race. Again, in part because of Dr. Paul's views on civil rights, views that he expanded on here last night on this show. Do you think that a private business has a right to say, we don't serve black people?
Yeah, I'm not in favor of any discrimination of any form. I would never belong to any club that excluded anybody for race. We still do have private clubs in America that can discriminate based on race. But I think what's important about this debate is not getting into any specific gotcha on this, but asking the question, what about freedom of speech? Should we limit speech from people we find abhorrent? Should we limit racists from speaking? I don't want to be associated with those people, but I also don't want to limit their speech in any way.
For the record, I had other stuff to ask Rand Paul about last night, but we ended up stuck on that one issue for 20 minutes, including blowing through our commercials. I'm very sorry to our sponsors and to my boss. But we stuck with it because I wasn't able to get a definitive answer from him on it. Should Woolworth lunch counters should have been allowed to stay segregated? Sir, just yes or no?
What I think would happen, what I'm saying is that I don't believe in any discrimination. I don't believe that any private property should discriminate either. And I wouldn't attend, wouldn't support, wouldn't go to.
Wouldn't attend, wouldn't support, wouldn't go to, but also apparently wouldn't support the government making that kind of discrimination illegal. Despite talking about that one thing for 20 minutes, in many ways our conversation was woolly on the specifics. In me chasing him trying to get an answer and in him running from being forced to give an answer, I actually think that we rounded the edges of the factual thing that we were talking about. So I would like to be specific about why this is a big deal, why it was worth staying on one topic, one question for so long, and why I think this might be important not just for the Senate race in Kentucky, but as sort of a tuning fork moment, an opportunity to hear some stuff in American politics, in American history, that is thrumming all along, but is very rarely heard. Dr. Paul spoke favorably of the Civil Rights Act in general last night, except he said for one part of it.
There's 10 different titles, to the Civil Rights Act, and 9 out of 10 deal with public institutions, and I'm absolutely in favor of. One deals with private institutions, and had I been around, I would have tried to modify that. I do defend and believe that the government should not be involved with institutional racism or discrimination or segregation in schools, busing, all of those things. But had I been there, there would have been some discussion over one of the titles of the Civil Rights.
There would have been some discussion over one of the titles of the Civil Rights Act. He would have tried to modify the one title that deals with private institutions. To be clear, this is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You see it here. There are 11 titles to it if you include the miscellaneous section. The title that Dr. Paul is raising his objections to is this one. Title II. Title II of the 1964 Civil Rights Act states, quote, all persons shall be entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of the goods, services, facilities, privileges, advantages, and accommodations of any place of public accommodation as defined in this section without discrimination on the ground of race, color, religion, or national origin. That is some of the more eloquent legalese of the whole of American statutory law, Title II of the Civil Rights Act. In practical terms, what it means is that any private business, a hotel, a motel, a restaurant, a lunch counter, a theater, a concert hall, a stadium, any private business that offers services to the general public cannot discriminate. It ended, for example, Woolworth's lunch counters practice of only serving white people. It made it illegal for a private business owner in Georgia, like, say, Lester Maddox, to ban black patrons from his restaurant. Mr. Maddox is seen here in this picture running an African-American man out of his restaurant at gunpoint. In Mr. Maddox's right hand, you can see a short-nosed revolver. Mr. Maddox's son is holding a pickaxe handle. When Lester Maddox later made his successful run for governor of Georgia, the pickaxe was adopted as the symbol of his campaign. The pickaxe, symbolizing the purported heroism of his efforts to keep his business white only, against the law. The reason we talk about this chapter in our country's history as the fight for civil rights is because it was a fight. There were two sides to it. There was the civil rights movement, activists pushing for equal access to the rights and privileges of citizenship for black Americans, and there was another side that was pushing back. Pro-segregation forces weren't just violent hoods, thugs in the streets, riotous forces, rogue policemen, individual bigots. The violence is what we all remember about that era, but there was also a very fervent intellectual and political side to the pro-segregation forces as well. Beyond the home state Southern segregationist politicians defending the way their states had always done things, there were also national figures who took the Southern side. People like William F. Buckley, founder of the modern-day conservative movement. In 1957, Mr. Buckley wrote this about the civil rights struggle, quote, the central question that emerges is whether the white community in the South is entitled to take such measures that are necessary to prevail politically and culturally in areas in which it does not predominate numerically. The sobering answer is yes. The white community is so entitled because for the time being, it is the advanced race. In 1960, Mr. Buckley wrote, quote, a sharp distinction must be made in evaluating the activity of the young Negroes on the march in the South. The first is that private property remains private. A Negro does not have the right to enter a privately owned restaurant whose proprietors choose, for whatever reasons, to bar access to it to non-whites. It is a right guaranteed to an American entrepreneur to refuse to do business with whomever he likes. William F. Buckley later said he regretted taking those stances. Now, you can say, as Rand Paul did last night, that you don't support the violence, the people who were actually physically beating civil rights demonstrators while they were fighting against segregation. Who would say they side with that? But do you think they had a point, regardless of how those people beating the protesters tried to make their point? Do you side with the intellectuals, with the politicians who weren't throwing the punches and murdering people, but who did argue that private business has the right to discriminate and the government is wrong to stop it? This isn't theoretical. This isn't a lifetime ago. This is modern American history. And apparently we don't all agree that when the federal government decided in 1964 that it would stop private businesses from discriminating, that was a good thing. If the government today stops a Pennsylvania pool from kicking out black kids, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is Bob Jones University allowed to ban interracial dating by its students? It's a private university. If it's not allowed to ban interracial dating, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And transcending race, if there is such a bright, even burning bright dividing line between private and public, can businesses refuse to serve Jews too? Baptists? Are fire codes unconstitutional? How about the minimum wage? Does the government have the right to tell BP that it ought to use safety technology to prevent spills when it drills offshore? Is it an unconstitutional overreach to tell liquor stores they can't sell liquor to kids? Can the government inspect meat? Should it say you can't put lead in those pacifiers you're manufacturing? Libertarian is not a 5-syllable shorthand word for Republican. It is a really specific worldview about the appropriate reach of federal law in this country. And when you are auditioning for a role as part of the federal government's highest lawmaking body, which makes laws for everyone in this country, questions about what you believe is the appropriate reach of federal law ought to be expected. And the answers to those questions sometimes reopen debates that no one anywhere near the mainstream of American politics had any idea were still controversial.